Okay, so in section 1, we're looking at solving quadratic equations. Before we kind of get into solving quadratic equations, first of all, what is a quadratic function? So a quadratic function takes this form. This f of x, this is just function notation. It just means the same thing as saying that is equal to y. So y is equal to this stuff here. So a quadratic, right, importantly, is where you have the highest exponent being a square term, or something squared. So you must see something squared, but it cannot go bigger than squared. Okay, so you've got to have something squared, and it's in this form: ax squared plus bx plus c. Okay, where a, b, and c are numbers, okay, are constants, and a cannot be equal to 0, because if a was equal to 0, okay, then this first term would be equal to 0, and there would be no square term. So a few examples of functions that are quadratics are these three here. So for example, f of x or y is equal to x squared is your most basic quadratic. And we're going to plot this on Desmos in a second. And I would invite you to play around with just plotting some different quadratics and seeing if you can notice or spot any interesting things about quadratics. Okay, so these three here, these are all quadratics because the highest exponent, the highest power, is a square power. So a square and a square, you can see it could just have one part. It could just have the ax squared part. In this case, the a is 1x squared. It could have three parts. Okay, something a, so ax squared, so 1x squared. Take away b is negative 4, and that c value is 4. And then here you've got negative x squared, so a would be negative 1. There's no bx part, b would be 0 in this case, and c is negative 5. And like I said, right, what's really, really useful is if I can get Desmos up and loaded, I can get it over onto the screen. Good. Okay, so that f of x just means y is equal to, the most basic quadratic is going to be, if we go and get this up, we can go and say x squared. So there we go, right, a quadratic takes this u shape. Okay, and similarly, right, if what would happen, and this is where you can go, and I would invite you to play around with it yourself, just to see what you can notice, right? Because if you make it negative, what's going to happen is you're going to see a reflection along the x-axis. Okay, so we can zoom out, and you can see, there we go. So the way you might have seen it at GCSE, you know, if it's positive, you can get this happy face, which you can see here. A bit of a, you know, yeah, interesting way of looking at it. So happy face, positive, negative, you get this down here. What happens if your quadratic has got maybe three parts to it, like y is equal to x squared, x squared plus, let's say, 5x plus 6, quite a simple quadratic. Well, there we go. You can see this quadratic, okay, it's positive again, so it's got this U shape, and it cuts through. You can see where it cuts through the x-axis at the points negative 2 and negative 3. Perhaps you already know why that's the case. Okay, perhaps you don't. Don't worry if you don't. What else can you see from it? You can see where it crosses the y-axis at the point 6. What about a quadratic like this? Okay, so we've got y is equal to, I don't know, let's make it a square. Let's go for something like x take away 2 squared, which is this green quadratic over here. So you can see this quadratic, right, it only cuts the x-axis, interestingly, at one point, which is the point 2. Why is that the case? You will see later on in the videos, okay, and it goes through the y-axis at the point 4. Okay, why is that the case? You can make it negative, see what happens to it, so make this part negative. There we go, it flips around. Okay, so you can really just play around with different quadratics. Maybe you try plotting something like this over here, and you might think, well, does it always need to cut the x-axis? If we copy it, which I can't do, we just type it in again, y equals to x squared, no, plus 5x plus 7. Well, this purple quadratic, you can see, okay, it doesn't cut the x-axis, so this, at any points. And you're going to see later on why that is the case. But I would just invite you just to play around with some different quadratics and see what you can find out about it, okay? Similarly, if you want to look at other graphs, you could do, but for the time being, we're focusing on quadratics, so that is that. Anyway, okay, so these are examples of quadratics. Good, very nice. In the first part of this chapter, we're looking at solving, how you solve a quadratic equation, okay? What does solving a quadratic equation really mean? Let's consider a example. So below, we've got the quadratic function. F of x just means y is x squared plus 5x plus 6, which has been plotted down here for us below. Solving, okay, means, like solving back at GCSE means finding, in this case, the missing variable, which is x. Okay, so solving the quadratic means finding the values in context where the curve cuts the x-axis, because you're trying to find the x values. So you're trying to find where it cuts this axis down here, which really should be labelled as the x-axis. Okay, and that's the y-axis. There we go. So we can see, right, visually from the graph, okay, that when we solve this quadratic, okay, you get the values x being -3, which is down here, and x being -2, which is down here. That is what we mean by solving a quadratic. You're finding the x values. There could be 2, there could be 1, or there could be 0, as you'll later see. Okay, in this case there is 2. You're seeing where this curve crosses the x-axis, which is -3 and -2, which is nice. So these values are called the solutions, okay, solving solutions, or the roots of the equations. Okay, so x being -3, being -2, you call either the solutions or the roots. You can hear them in 2 different ways. Okay, there are many ways that you can solve a quadratic. Okay, you can solve it graphically, which is shown here. So literally you've drawn the quadratic and you can see, right, the solutions are -3 and -2. But there's also different ways you can solve a quadratic: by factorising, using the quadratic formula, completing the square, or by using a scientific calculator. In the next sort of series of videos, we're going to be looking at solving quadratics through factorising, which is probably something you've seen before, but we'll go through it as if you haven't seen it before. That is it for this introduction in solving quadratics. Thank you. We'll get on to how you actually solve quadratics by factorising in the next video with examples. Thank you.